Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Print Out. This is an annual student-led event where we discuss all things print. My name is Rin, and I'll be your MC. I just got my first dose, and I'm feeling it. This year, we're focusing on something that we're all pretty familiar with, which is public work and art in the non-traditional studio space. All of our artists today will discuss the troubles and the triumphs of working with the public, collaborating, and working in the communities in which the art serves. Since COVID, we've all had to reevaluate our practice. And for me, at least, collaboration has become really valuable since we weren't allowed to work with people for a really long time. So hopefully today we'll learn a lot about the ways in which we can communicate and engage beyond ourselves as artists. As we know, like the West has a really strict individualist sort of artistic practice. And I'm hoping today that I'll learn how to open that up and be more open to collaboration and working with different communities and working in the public. We have 4 presentations today. We have Yara and Davina represented by Davina. We have Peter Liversidge. We have Anna Barman and Donna and Wayne from Future Hackney. Before we jump in, I just want to let you know how this is going to go. The presenters are going to present and we will have a Q&A and a discussion at the end. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we will be able to look at them. Just make sure you reference who the question is for. For instance, if you have a question for Davina, make sure that you write that the question is for Davina so that when we get to the end of the presentations, we know who the question is for. But you can write questions as you have them in the Q&A portion. Are we ready? I think we're ready. We're gonna start with Davina. Davina Drummond is a Scottish social practice artist who lives and works in London. Davina graduated with a BA in Fine Arts Textiles from Goldsmiths in 2005, and she graduated with a postgraduate diploma in art education from the Institute of Education in London. Her collaborator, Yara El Sherbini, lives in California and works between the US and the UK. Yara graduated with a BA in Fine Arts in Context from the University of West England, and she has an MA in Fine Art from Slade. Together, Yara and Davina are a social practice duo who make site and context responsive, bold, playful, and thought-provoking public artwork. Unfailingly inventive, they root their practice in the everyday using a lightness of touch and humor to make their works more accessible. They've created works for multiple world-leading institutions, such as the Tate Modern and the Tate Britain, the Biennale, BAM in New York, Somerset House, Manchester Art Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, Whitechapel, Studio Museum, Harlem, the VMA, wow, the list goes on and on, Modern Art, Oxford, the RCA, just to name a few. They are also currently touring their large-scale public artwork, Arrival and Departure. This is until 2022. I'm pretty sure that Davina will be talking about that. So Davina, you can take it away.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the introduction. I feel now you've mentioned that our work tends to be quite humorous and playful, but actually the work that I'm going to talk about today, Arrivals and Departures, is actually quite heavy work. So just bear that in mind, but generally most of our work tends to be quite playful. But yes, let's get started. So firstly, I really want to say a big thank you for having us here today, and I wish Yara could be here too, but I'm super excited to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about our work. So sorry, I'm just conscious the slideshows come up, but it's taken up my whole screen, so I can't see my notes. I've just come up on my other computer, sorry. Normally I have to control what size the Zoom is, but for some reason it's dominating the screen. So luckily preserved. Okay, so yes, what I wanted to do today was give a bit of a brief introduction to our practice, but I'm super mindful we only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to skip that bit. So if we actually skip the next slide, and I'll just say what the next slide is, but I won't go into detail. So yes, if we go to the next slide, please. So basically, that slide before was our manifesto, and normally I kind of go into a bit of detail and talk about why we have a manifesto and how we work around that, but I'm not going to mention that now, and you can also look at our website for more details. Can we move on to the next slide as well? I'm going to miss that as well. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go straight into talking about arrivals, departures, and when I talk about that, I will also in particular talk about context, and then talk a little bit as well about our ideas around what is public art and how does it function. And then at this time, I'll talk a little bit about collaboration, but if not, I'm hoping that will come up through the sort of panel discussion later, which in some ways is more interesting, because I feel when we talk about collaboration, it's really lovely for that to happen within a conversation. That's a kind of collaborative conversation rather than one person just talking. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant, just checking. Okay, so let's talk about arrivals, departures.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a bit of background noise with somebody talking in the background, just so you know, in case you haven't got your mute on. So arrivals, departures premiered last year at Somerset House. It's a project we've actually been working on for a super long time, but we finally had it finished for last year. And I'm just going to give a little bit of context about what that is. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go back and forth because now my notes are no longer on my computer for some reason. So let's just get my notes. So, sorry, I was super organized, but everything's changed last second. Okay, so arrivals, departures, as you can see, is quite a large scale work, and it takes the form of an arrivals and a departures board, much like you'd see at a train station or an airport, super recognizable. But instead of announcing names of destinations, the work announces names of people submitted by the public. So names of people who are arriving, people being born, and names of people who are departing, people who have died. For us, Arrivals Departures offers a very timely platform to engage with the effects of COVID-19 and the continuing racial and social injustice that we face within our communities. Through the political act of naming, through the actual act of inviting the public to choose which names go up on the boards, the interactive installation offers an opportunity to explore issues, very everyday, like accessible issues around birth, life, death, loss, collective grief, alongside social and racial injustice, to question and change who is honoured through public statues and memorials. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. So this slide is just a bit of a close-up of the departures board. And what I wanted to point out is if you look closely, you'll see that it's actually mechanical. So it's not LED. And it was really important for us that the work was mechanical to really pay our respect to those names that people are choosing to go up, and also to have that beautiful aesthetic quality and that nostalgic quality, and to make that lovely noise that it makes when the new names come up. Next slide, please. So another close-up of the arrivals board, and then next slide again, please. And I've just put this slide. Now, this is an image that everybody will probably recognise from what was happening in Bristol last year, with the statues being taken down. And this was obviously happening not just in Bristol, but throughout the country, and actually indeed in other countries too. And the reason why I've shown this image is just to really reinforce that for us, this work is about thinking about public memorials. How do public memorials act? And I guess what we're interested in is thinking about how can we make something which is fluid and responsive to the community, to the people who are around and engaging with that particular memorial spot. So rather than a select group of people, a committee of some kind, making a choice to name somebody in a very static, permanent way, we're more interested in thinking about, well, how as artists can we make something that allows everybody to remember, that allows everybody to make their own choice about who they want to name, and in a way literally create an artwork which is a naming service rather than the artists themselves being the ones that choose who is named. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so context. So context is something that's absolutely the heart of what Yara and I do. It's our anchor. We literally like live and breathe context. It just comes up again and again and again with everything we do. So I'll give you some examples of what context means to us. So when we think about context, we think about place, location. We think about the history, not just the history of the place, but the history of the institution who are commissioning the work. We think about current events that are happening both in the local area and very much in the sort of very deep locality of the space, but also internationally, because that can have an impact. We think about politics, we think about social context, and of course we think about time. And when I mean time, I mean literally we'll think about the time of the year the work's going to show and what sort of calendar events might be happening at that time of the year that could have an impact on the work. And then finally, but probably most importantly, and I'm sure everybody would agree, we think about the people. So who are the people who are going to engage with the work? Who are the people that are going to be around the work, who maybe live, work, experience the work in a daily way? Who are these people and how can we really think about them at the heart of what we're doing? So if I talk about arrivals and departures, for example, we can move on to the next slide, please. We had a few things to think about when thinking about context. And the first thing was to think about, well, actually, how does the work give context to what it's trying to do? So we're inviting people to put these names up. And absolutely, if I put a name up of somebody, that has meaning, direct meaning between me and the artwork. I see the name I've chosen to go up on the board. It takes 30 seconds. I go online on my phone, put the name up and it's there. But what do those names mean to other people who are around me? Does that name mean anything? Does it matter? I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just about that experience between the individual and the artwork. But we did want to think about how we could offer context. So on the website, we have a story section. So when people put up their names, they're also invited to put up a story. And we find about 60 to 70% of people do choose to put a story up. Some people put poems up, some people put one sentence, it's up to them. But if you have a chance afterwards, go onto the website, which is arrivalsanddepartures.net. Got to get that in there. You can go on the story section. You'll see there are thousands of stories that people put up, and they're incredibly heartwarming and super interesting to read. And they really give a sense of the kind of breadth and depth of how people have been engaging with the work. So that was one thing. So that's a simple way to think about context. But then if we move on to the next slide, please. Some of our examples of stories. And then the next slide again, please. So another layer of context when thinking about this work is considering where the work's going to be shown, and also how we then consider the public programme. So when we show this work, we always have a bespoke, custom public programme of events, so workshops, talks, all sorts of things, ranging from bingo to yoga. We have, and we really think about what that public programme is in an incredibly collaborative way, working with the programmers of the site to make it really contextually responsive. So if we give an example, this is Somerset House. I mentioned earlier, we were really keen for the work to be shown at Somerset House as its first premiere outing. It was there for 2 months last autumn. Hopefully some of you might have seen it. And for us, the reason why we wanted it to be at Somerset House, of course, it's a lovely place for it to be, but there was a reason, and it was contextual, because Somerset House was the registrar office of the whole of England for many years, and it stopped being the registry office for births, deaths and marriages 50 years ago last year. So for it to be there last year was a way to mark the history of the site, and just felt completely, contextually poetic and perfect. So that's an example, a very simple example of context. We move on to the next slide, please. Here's the work in New York at BAM, and it's outside Brooklyn Town Hall, which seemed a really appropriate place to show the work. But when we had the work at, in New York, for us, what kept on coming back again and again when thinking about arrivals and departures and New York is thinking about immigration. So the issues that we all face everywhere, but in America, it's very in your face, it's very heavy issues around immigration. So we had to do something. So we worked with different immigration activists to do a public program around that. Then the next slide, please. And then we have the work in Brighton, where we worked with the queer community. I won't go into detail because I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on. That's the work in Norfolk and Norwich. If we move on to the next slide. When the work was in Norfolk and Norwich, it was in May, and that was a particular moment where there was a lot of violence between Palestine and Israel. I'm sure all of you are aware of that. And so as a way to address this, because we felt it was so much at the heart of what was happening at that time, we invited an incredible organisation called the New Story Leadership, who are a peace-keeping organisation that specifically work between Israel and Palestine. And we invited them to share stories of people who had died during that period. And we move on to, I actually think that might be the last slide. So I'm just going to talk for 1 minute about public art and then I'm finishing. So I could literally talk for an hour, so I'm really rushing through this, apologies. So public art, I literally want to just ask some questions and one or two thoughts. So for us, we're really passionate about public art, and I'm just going to set a tea. And what we're really passionate about is, well, what is public art? Is public art which is put in the public realm? We so often get told it is, oh, it's outside on the street, it's public art. For us, that's not enough. We're really interested in art which is free for public art. So it's in the public realm. It's designed and planned and thought about for the public. So it's very making the public art at the forefront of how people are going to interact and engage with it. And then finally, it has some form of activation through participation or engagement. So there's that interactive element that really encourages some more of a meaningful engagement. So with that in mind, we'd ask such questions as, is public art for the public or in the public? And we're really super interested in spaces. So what defines public space? Is a commercial space like a shopping centre and more of an authentic public space than, for example, a free museum? And with so much time now being spent virtually and online, how do we think about the virtual space as a public realm for artworks? So with that in mind, I'm going to leave there. I've got loads of notes in collaboration, but I'm hoping that will come up naturally through our conversations in the panel discussion later. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Davina. That was great. I loved how you said you lived and breathed context. I think that's very important. So we are moving on to Peter Liversidge, who was born in 1973 in Lincoln, UK. His conceptually focused work spans photography, collage, sculpture, and performance. His approach to his work invites collaboration and subsequently formed by influences beyond his control. His artworks are investigations of coincidence and not limited to the language of a single medium. Peter has presented commissioned work at the Tate Modern and has had solo exhibitions at the MAC in Belfast, Jupiter Artland in Scotland, Bonnier's Konsthal in Stockholm, the Van Aben Museum in Eindhoven, lots of international places I cannot pronounce, the Whitechapel Gallery in London, the I8 in Reykjavik, and he is represented by Kate McGarry in London. Since April 10th, 2021, he has been installing signs thanking the NHS staff and other frontline workers at the corner of Mile End Park in London. With the help of his youngest son, Peter has added to the group every night after dark. There are now over 300 individual signs. Peter, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you very much for that introduction. I have to make one slight correction. It was actually 7th of April 2020 that I was installing the work I'm going to speak about today, which is sign paintings for the NHS. Sign paintings for the NHS came out of that initial feeling of isolation from the first lockdown. There was a point where my youngest son, who you'll see in a minute in a photograph, he'd just been on a French trip. My birthday's on the 15th of March. And he came back on the 15th of March. And then on the 16th of March, he showed symptoms of COVID. And that was at a point before any other lockdown had come into place. Obviously, that happened on the 23rd of March. And that sort of threw me, my wife, and my eldest son into kind of complete chaos, because we knew we had to isolate, but we didn't quite know what was happening. And the government advice was so poor at that time. And we went into that first sort of initial lockdown, having already locked down for a week. And the work that I'm going to talk about, the sign paintings for the NHS, really came out of wanting to acknowledge the care and the dedication that the NHS, but other key workers too, how they provided not a service, but they became something that almost like a family member that you could rely on. The work itself, when I first started installing it, it started just with this first sign, just as a thank you for the NHS. And I really didn't want to be an artist making a response to an ongoing and unfolding crisis. I had family links to the NHS, but both my parents were in the NHS. My brother works for a company who make ventilators, not just for the NHS, but for private hospitals too. My grandparents were in the NHS. I've been a lifelong NHS supporter and continue and will continue to be so. And I really didn't want to be an artist making a project about the NHS or about what was unfolding, but I also felt that there had to be a public voice, a way of supporting the NHS or supporting those on the front line against what was an unfolding health crisis. And so very slowly I started to install the signs. This is on the 7th of April 2020 on the corner of Roman Road and Wennington Green. Wennington Green, you probably, or some of you might know, is where Rachel Whiteread's house was installed. I lived just around the corner. It became a daily and nightly event where I'd go to the studio and I'd paint the signs, dry the signs, often drying them with hair dryers, just responding to the news, thinking about how that work could appear without anyone knowing it was me. Not because I was wanting to hide the fact it was me. I just, as I was saying, I didn't want it to be about me. It was about everything else that was happening. Not just the NHS response, the response to the government, the way that there was no leadership. It felt like there was a space not necessarily to be critical, but just to be thankful and say thank you for what was amazing support. So as I started making these signs on a daily basis, I'd go to the studio. It became a daily ritual, which really helped me in those early stages of lockdown where everything was so confusing. There was no guide, what we couldn't do, what we could do. Should we wear a mask? Should we wash our hands? Should we sanitize? What should we sanitize shopping? Should we sanitize? It was all this kind of questions. And the work really did allow me to break away from that and get back into the ritual of going to the studio, thinking about, how I could approach supporting those in a small way. I don't think that was a grand gesture. It was just to say that thank you, because it was a lot of the things that the conversations I was subsequently having when I was installing the signs with members of the public as they were going by. But what was interesting for me was the anonymity of installing this work was broken when I noticed there were people taking photographs of the signs and then posting those on social media. And then one Tuesday, there was a guy from Reuters there who just noticed that I was, every morning, I should explain that every night after darkness, I'd install the signs, and then every morning I'd go and check the signs. They were just cardboard, acrylic paint on cardboard. That was hot glued onto a stick or a cane, and then that was cable tied or gaffer taped onto the supporting fence that's surrounding Wennington Green, which is a public park, publicly accessible park. And this work, I wanted this work to grow as well, sort of in its, as you can see, the top left image here is on the 8th of April, and the bottom right image is on the 14th of May. And the work itself just grew and was a call for more PPE, for thanking hospice staff, thanking shop staff, making sure that we acknowledge these people who are helping us to carry on potentially with our day-to-day lives. And it was really important that the work itself then grew organically. And my son also helped. And what was really interesting in that for me was that as he was assisting making the work, he had a really interesting response to the idea that it was his teachers, it was the NHS, it was all these people who help us normally outside of the time of a pandemic, that support us and keep us going as individuals, as groups. And it's so important that we recognise that. And so we would go out after nightfall, which as the nights drew out became later and later. So unfortunately, because he was only 12, he couldn't come out after about 9:30, 10 o'clock because he had to go to bed. So I then continued making the work myself. And what was very interesting was that as I was doing this as a daily practice, and this was for 9 weeks, I was doing this every single day, that I began to meet people, dog walkers, pediatric nurse, and get a real insight into what and how other people are experiencing the pandemic. Speaking to doctors, nurses, there are times when I would get heckled from people as they drove past. And it was that sort of isolation that I felt, that sort of, the vulnerability of, because where I was installing the work behind, if you look at the slide in front of you now, I was facing the fence, applying the gaffer tape, applying the signs to the fence, and my back was to the road. And often you'd hear and feel people drawing up behind you, windows rolling down. And a couple of times, there's heckles like, get a life, mate. Or, what the fuck do you think you're doing? Don't waste your time, etc., etc. And then other times there'd be ambulances that would drive by and they'd slow down and they'd just shout, thank you. And there was one time, because of where Wennington Green is, it's sort of it's at a crossroads of Roman Road and Grove Road. But it's also midway between Homerton Hospital and Royal London Hospital. And at 10:30 at the change of the shifts, where the day shift would go and they'd go on to night shift, at about 10:30, there'd be cars full of nurses who would drive past. And one car, as I was installing a group of signs, just slowed down and stopped. And obviously you can hear that and you don't really want to look around because you're trying to do this in a quiet way and it's a public space and you're not entirely sure if you should be doing it there. And they just stopped and said, thank you. They rolled down the windows and clapped and said, thank you, and then drove off. The work itself then continued to grow. And then members of the public also added signs, which it felt like it had been accepted in a way that I wasn't expecting. Again, there was no plan to this work. When I first made that sign, I hadn't planned to make this work. The length of, from the corner of Roman Road up to the canal, which is about 65, 70 metres. It celebrated those triumphs and also celebrated the tragedies. Donald Sueto, a friend of his who worked with him at shifts at Homerton, just happened to be walking by as I was installing and repairing signs one morning. And he asked whether he could make a sign, and then the next day this sign appeared as a tribute. And it became a thing that unexpectedly had this viral presence. The first time really I'd had a work that I had no control over. And once this work had gone out into the public realm, you realize that actually there is no real control. As soon as the work leaves the studio, it is, as the previous speaker was talking about, it is the context, and the context of this space was it's a public park. Parks were designed for recreation and for people to get out and to be together in nature in the city. And then to have this as a tribute to those who are helping us and to, allow us, and not allow us, but support us through a time of extreme crisis was really important to me, that this work could exist. And without, I don't want to over contextualize it. It's signed, it's handwritten text on cardboard, found cardboard. My neighbours started to realise that I had been making these signs, and they'd collect cardboard for me. Members of the public would start giving me gaffer tape or canes or other things, asking me what I'd like or need to help them make the work, what it became. And it was really important just to, as I keep saying, but it's really, that's the crux of the work, is that it's a response to say thank you. That's all it is. And it was very important to me that it had a period of time where the work existed as a thank you, but then equally it had a period of time when it would disappear. And as it had just gradually appeared over this 9 weeks, I thought it was very important that it just disappeared. So on the 28th of May last year, a group of 10 of us managed to take 571 signs down over the 65, 70 metres in just over 2 hours. And so as the work appeared gradually, it then suddenly disappeared. And now I can say very thankfully it's found a new home with Museum of London, which the context for that is perfect, because they have the collection of the signs from Brian Hawes from outside of Parliament, but also really importantly, they have the signs and the archives from the suffragettes as well, which for context, the printer who printed all of the suffragettes' material, their posters, all their flyers, all their leaflets, was based on Roman Road, just 500 yards from where these signs are. But again, the work, although it was in the public space, it also took on a life of its own through social media, and it was generally very well received. And again, I feel like I have to step away from it, that it isn't and shouldn't necessarily be my work, that it is, because it is a public work and is a public acknowledgement of a period of, a period in time, which I don't know how, we can't know how it will be judged historically, but it was very important that it just existed. There was some repair during storms and rain, but luckily last year, the weather was very kind and I only had 3 days where I had to repair and replace signs. Anyway, I just want to say thank you very much for letting me talk about the work, and also I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I think we can all relate to feeling the need to be the artist who talks about current events but not wanting to be that person. I think we can all relate to that. So we're moving on to Anna Barham. She is a London-based artist working across video, sound, print, installation, and performance. Her work centers on collective reading processes that explore the transformation of meaning as language is translated between different bodies, forms, and technologies. Recent projects include Chelsea Space London, Index in Stockholm, Quote Unquote from Bucharest, Site Gallery Sheffield, EMA Middlesbrough, the Playground Festival, the Welcome Collection, KW in Berlin. She also co-runs a reading group called They Are All of Them Themselves, and they repeat it and hear it with Irene Revel. She also has recently published a new book called Poisonous Oysters. So Anna, you have the floor when you are ready.
Thanks, I'm here, but it says that my video has been disabled by the host. Okay, I think I'm in. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yes, okay, fantastic, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Where are we? Okay, so I hope you can see the first slide. Please tell me if you can't. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about a project that I run with Irene Revel, the reading group. They are all of them themselves, and they repeat it and I hear it, which is a quote from The Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. And in fact, that book is what this project arose out of. In 2019, in June, for Long Player Day, Irene organized a 4-hour reading group. It was called the Making of Americans Marathon Reading Group. And this is an image of that. And it was a way for her to sort of explore some of the text. It's a very long book for anyone that doesn't know it. It's 925 pages. And it has historically been read aloud in a kind of marathon format. So it takes about 50 hours to read in its entirety. And Irene's research, she's a curator and she does a lot of research on feminist performance scores, and in particular on the Fluxus artist Alison Knowles and composer Anea Lockwood. And they, in 1974, over the New Year's Eve of 74-75, with someone else, Jean Rigg, who was the manager of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, they organised a 50-hour marathon reading of The Making of Americans. And so this 4-hour version was a sort of a way to gather some people together and sort of get a feel for the book and also discuss these marathon readings. These are invitation cards to the first ones organised. The first one was at Artist Space, and then it moved to Paula Cooper Gallery in New York, where it continued through the 80s. This is an image of it later in the 80s at Paula Cooper, not run by those particular people anymore. And then Triple Canopy, an organisation in New York, around 2012 onwards, did for about 3 years. They also ran one of these marathon reading sessions. And we discovered that Emmett Williams had also organised one in 1973. It was a public marathon, and it was part of the language happenings class that he ran at Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. So reading this book has this particular history of how people have grappled with it. And I thought I would just contextualize it in terms of my own practice, where I've been working with a format that I call a live production reading group. This is one of those, where I generate material collaboratively with groups of readers and speech-to-text software. And I'm interested in how the particularities of each reader's voice, so like the tone, the accent, the cadence, the mistakes they might make, as well as the acoustics of the room, all get captured by the software and transformed into new meanings. And then subsequently, each reader reads the output from the computer, which has no punctuation and has to reauthor the text, and this process repeats and repeats. So in this format that I've established, the text is quite literally produced and reauthored by the group. But I do use some Stein texts in these groups, and they perform in a sort of very interesting way. And I was interested in general how reading aloud, what that really does in terms of authorship, in terms of community, sort of the texture of that activity, especially in sort of this digital moment, what it is to come together and actually read from books or pieces of paper, and to vocalize the text. So Irene and I both sort of converged on The Making of Americans, and we were interested in the marathon format, but found that in a way it kind of precludes you from hearing or reading the whole text, because I mean, I know that I wouldn't be able to stay up for 50 hours one stretch to hear the whole text. So we talked about it and wondered about sort of changing the way that the time structure would work, and to read the book over the course of a year instead, so that we were interested in how the book would actually bleed into your life. Like that year of your life would be quite inflected by this repeated action of reading the book together with other people. So that's what we did in the beginning of 2020. We worked out sort of how many pages we had, how much we'd have to read each time, and we came up with this original structure of reading every 4 weeks for 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon. And the first 3 weeks, first three sessions were held here where I'm speaking from in my house. And then, of course, coronavirus came along and we took the reading group online. So this is one of our early meetings that we had online. And it was, I mean, that was an amazing sort of thing that we were able to kind of keep going at that moment where you sort of feel like you're losing touch with everyone. But to have this, this book that kind of held us together and created a kind of container or a site that we could still kind of meet through. So our format is also quite different. The original marathon formats were that people would sign up for a 15 to 20 minute slot, and they would come to wherever it was being hosted and they would read for that time. And I guess there was some people that would stay to listen a lot, but it seemed to be a lot about kind of performing, and not really about a group being constructed out of that activity. Whereas we read a page each, so it's quite fast paced, and you know that you're going to come around and read again. And so if you join the group, you're there for the whole duration of the group, which was 4 hours when they were in person, or 2 hours online. And we don't, sometimes there's a little informal bit of discussion about the text afterwards, but it's really a reading aloud group. It's about voicing the text. It's not about analysing it or interpreting it. And a really beautiful thing happens when the page ends, and even if it's mid-word or mid-sentence, then the next person carries on from that. So it's like this kind of passing of a baton through the text, and how people carry on each other's intonation or not it's part of this very kind of close listening and sort of collaborative group listening that happens. And we do live broadcast it, so you can listen in while we're reading, and we have a very small listenership, so it's really mainly about the group, but there is this sort of slight heightening, I suppose, of everyone's performances, because they know that they might be listened into from outside. So the Stein text itself, I've just got a couple of close-ups of the book, so you can kind of see the language. It's very, the book itself is very repetitive. In a way, that's why I felt I could never really read it on my own silently, because you're constantly given that feeling of when you're reading a paragraph and then you feel like, oh, I've read the same line because you got distracted. But this book that's kind of inherent in the language within it, that she just turns these kind of same groups of words over and over to kind of extract every permutation and kind of possible combination of meaning out of them. So there's this real, and no one's read the book before or the pages before, so we're all sight reading it, and there's a real kind of grasping for meaning and a sort of tension in this unfolding of meaning in the voice, in the live moment with your sort of fellow participants or audience. And this is another short excerpt. So we read the book, and we had probably, I should have counted before, there's probably about 50 people, I guess, that over the course of the year took part in reading. There's a hardcore of people that have really read the whole book, but other people came in and out. And by the end, I think by the end of the year, when we completed the book, we had a really sort of strong sense of community and wanting to continue reading. Someone did suggest that we could just read The Making of Americans over again, which I am attracted to on one level, but I think we all felt it had been such a kind of Groundhog Day kind of a year with all the lockdowns and everything, that just to read the same book again was a little bit too hardcore. So we've been taking suggestions from the group of other texts to read, with the sort of central core aim is that they are books that need to be read aloud, that either that you couldn't really read them to yourself, or that something is brought to them from the reading aloud that just isn't really there on the page. So we read How to Write by Gertrude Stein, which is a series of essays. It was The Making of Americans, for all its sort of experimental form and its length. It does have, there are characters who sort of persist throughout the book. It's the story of two families, and that this book doesn't have any of that. It's really much more sort of poetic and really enjoyable to read, because of you just sort of have to really launch yourself into it. And someone compared it to feeling like you're falling down the stairs through these words, and you just sort of grab onto whatever you can grab and try and make a sentence out of that. But it didn't have the same kind of cohesion, I think, that The Making of Americans had. And then most recently, the book that we've just been reading and just finished is this Elfriede Jelinek, Charges, which is actually, she calls a play, but it's written, it just looks like a normal prose, but it's a sort of polyvocal text about refugees, sort of currently and through history. And she borrows language from all sorts of different places. And so, you know, like online or historical plays or people's testimonies. And it's all interwoven, and even mid-sentence, the speaker might sort of change and you're not really sure who's changing. There's a really kind of interesting way that she uses how words sound. So we read it in translation. I mean, it's an amazing translation, I think, because all of this wordplay does come across in the English that I think, you know, obviously is there in the German. So we read this together over 3 sessions, and it was a much more, obviously it's a much more charged text, and it had such a weight of responsibility that we all felt to voicing this material. And even for the person who had suggested it had read it, you know, as a normal book silently to themselves before, and was talking about how having the sort of witnesses of the group, or the act of reading aloud, how that was changing the kind of weight of the language for her. So that's the project really. We're continuing with suggestions. The next book that we're going to read is by Clarice Lispector, Agua Viva, and I think it's quite a short book, so I think we're going to do it in a single 4-hour online session in August. But yeah, thank you for letting me talk about that, and look forward to the conversation and questions later.
Thanks, Anna. I thought it was really interesting you showing the before and after of your reading group through COVID. I thought those were very important visuals to see. We are moving on to Future Hackney, Donna Travis and Wayne Kirchlow. They are Future Hackney. Set on the streets of Ridley Road and Gillette Square in Dalston, Future Hackney documents Caribbean and African locals, a living archive seeking to highlight the cultural and historical contributions of these communities to the borough. Working at the intersection of photography and social engagement, they create site-specific exhibitions. It is their belief that the visual arts should be on the streets and for everyone to view and enjoy. Their work brings together various groups of individuals to counteract media representations and engage with social issues. They are a small collective of professional visual artists who co-author with locals, youth, and residents to produce these images and stories. Before we move on to Donna and Wayne, don't forget to write your questions in the Q&A section, because after Donna and Wayne will be the question portion. So if Future Hackney wants to take it away.
Hi. Can everyone see us? Wayne, are you there? Right.
I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Right, so Wayne and I are Future Hackney, and just to give you a bit of background, Wayne is a photographer who's done a wide selection of work, and I come from a documentary background. I studied at Goldsmiths and worked in documentary film. And 3 years ago, we got together and thought that Ridley Road and Gillett Square, which is a space opposite Ridley Road, has the same community, seemed to be under threat in that the communities that had invested in the space over a number of years were finding it difficult to stay there because of the decline of the space, and also the rents were increasing. And I think gentrification is now too soft a term to use, but there is an idea that, in London, that, certain people are moving in, and other communities that have been there for a long time are having to leave or transition to other places that are more affordable. So I specifically contacted a group called Save Ridley Road, and although we knew that we couldn't do that, we did think that it was important to document the space, and as I said, the communities that had made that space relevant as a London space, I feel. Wayne, do you have anything to?
No, that's a pretty good summary there, Don. If we want to move to the next slide, we're just going to sort of just show you what we're going to try and talk through in this condensed time here. So it's mainly to keep us honest more than anything else, to be honest. So we've, as Don has just done, she spoke about who we are and why we've created Future Hackney. I think we want to spend a little bit of time on the importance of co-authorship, which is the sort of underpinning elements of Future Hackney, what Future Hackney is all about. Also, that links in quite nicely with the whole sort of concept around engagement as well, which is very key. It kind of helps us with our documentary. We'll talk about the exhibition and give you a view of what the current exhibition looks like, and actually talk about some future projects that we've got in the pipeline. So next slide. Okay. Do you want to talk through that, Don?
Right, so this is just giving the context of what we were sent in terms of what the students were interested in, the importance of shared public narratives, which is what we do in the public participation of the work itself. So we'll go on to talk about this in the next slides, and how we have a number of examples of ways that we incorporate the community in documentary. And having studied documentaries, as I said, I did feel that historically it's been middle class people telling working class stories, and we wanted to change that and make sure really that the communities we were documenting were definitely the co-authors on this with us, rather than the people we were documenting. And yeah, this slide just goes on to explain that the traditional viewing format of the gallery has become precarious in an age where, we are now online. But with us, really, Wayne, I think it's kind of, we were really more concerned pre-COVID about the people we were working with. We wanted them to see the photographs up, and we knew that a coffee table book might be unaffordable and that they might not be comfortable in the galleries. So we decided pre-COVID even that we were going to put our work up outside.
And I think really to emphasise this point is to make the art inclusive. As Donna said, the community that we're co-authoring with, we're documenting, are not necessarily the same people that might frequent the traditional white box, as we like to call it. So we wanted to kind of bring the artwork and the finished artwork out into the community, so the community feel that they've had an vested interest in it. They co-authored it. It's not a surprise. We don't fly into the area with our cameras and by stealth take lots of photographs and disappear into the night and the images appear. All the people we work with are aware of what we're doing. We've spent a long time in this particular area and space. Most of it is, as all of us have been involved in documentary know, it's building that trust. And without that trust, we won't be able to get the images that we're trying to get. And we won't be able to represent that community in the sincere way that it should be. So that's really important to kind of understand. Okay, next slide. So we talked about who we are, and the key strengths here is not only with the co-authorship, but it's also working with locals and the youth, especially. We've got a lot of initiatives where we're working with the youth in the area, providing workshops. that can take certain youth from backgrounds which would not necessarily allow them to be able to express themselves artistically. And we've kind of showed them new skills through, in this case, through photography and visual arts. So that is very key that we're running that in the background. It's something that's not in front of what we do, but it's something that kind of is the real basis of what we're all about, and continues us going forward. Okay. Also, just to give you a view, so if you're thinking about doing this yourself, is understanding, well, how do I do this? Is it expensive, etc.? We do, like most of us, have to, put a proposal together, go to various different investors who sell the project to them. And hopefully they understand what we're trying to achieve in the community and why we're doing this. So we have funding through the National Lottery, the Arts Council, etc. But there's a bit of work that you need to do that. So it's spending that time putting a proposal that is engaging, and that will garner the funding that you need to be able to put on these exhibitions. Okay, next slide. Want to talk about co-authorship there, Don?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time really getting to know people on the road, and we have certain key people who help us and introduce us to people that they know on the road that may have a history with the area. So, we have quite a few people that help us, and we give them volunteer bursaries, because we do feel that if we're being paid, then they should be paid as well. And that's very important to us. And again, we feel it's something quite innovative that we haven't seen other artists do, which is actually pay the community to work with us, and they have real roles, and we do quite a lot of planning with them. If Wayne and I are going to go there and photograph people, we set that up with the community. And it's really nice to do that. You do really feel a sense that is real co-authorship when you're actually planning, photo shoots for people. And we've done some amazing things, like we've set up dark rooms on the road. There's a very derelict space inside. And we set up dark rooms where we took in huge cameras, photograph the community, and then actually develop them on site, which was amazing. We've done Polaroid workshops. So we're using a wide range of medium with a wide range of groups. We've worked with long-term unemployed and young people, again, giving out bursaries and volunteer costs. Just as an example, we're currently working with a local Caribbean family who have 6 children. One of the oldest boy of the family didn't want to be in the picture, but he's just finished studying A-level photography. So we're going to get him to take the image of his family. And again, it's kind of real co-authorship. He's the photographer, he will be named as the photographer. Of course, we will assist him. He's only 16 or 17. And his image is going to be up on a very important wall in the middle of Hackney, working with Create London, who are funding us. And it's part of a Windrush initiative. So we are incredibly happy, Wayne and I, as artists, to have this young man who is, a promising up and coming photographer, and really giving him the opportunity to be a part of this. So, yeah. Wayne, should we just next?
Yeah, go to the next one, go to some examples then. So what we're going to give you is 2 examples of what we need to do to be able to, the story behind the image, I suppose that's what I'm getting to. What's the story behind the image? How do we engage so that when you see these images, there will be written oral stories from these individuals, or quotations from these individuals that we're documenting. But this is a couple of examples of what we need to do. So this is a shot of Dennis, and this was created by Don here. So Don, you probably can tell me what Dennis is all about. What's his story?
Yeah, I'm just going to keep this short because I'm aware of time. But Dennis is someone who I've worked with. I'm working with Dennis again as part of Create London and Windrush initiative across the borough. So we're interested in putting Dennis on the wall. And Dennis is very aware of the whole story of what's going on. Again, we give him a small bursary for his time and effort with us, and I arranged photo shoots with him. He is known as Dennis the Boxer in the local area. He's an elder. He's very well respected. He's quite vulnerable, but he has an incredible use of language and knowledge about, you know, colonialism and British politics. Enoch Powell, I mean, he really knows across the board. He knows his history. So he's a great person to work with, and I've been working with him over a few months. It is very time consuming. You know, people have their lives as well. You have to be very aware of this, that they're not just, you know, in your time frame. But we do manage to meet up quite a lot, and we talk about history, his place in the area and how he feels about the community. And I think he's very loved and respected across the board by the community. So the younger people really care about him, and the more elders really respect him. And his story, once we kind of put the wall up, I think it's the 24th of September, we're putting this wall up in the middle of Hackney Central with about 14 to 15 large images. Dennis's, there'll be a QR code, and people can connect to, so people will see the image of Dennis, but then they can connect to his story, you know, from the wall to the website, to the Instagram, and then, you know, feedback on that really, which again is another example of co-authorship.
Okay, so thanks there, Don. So mindful of time. Can we go to the next one, please, quickly? So here's another particular individual. This person's name is Abraham. He's from Nigeria. He came over to this country when he was 18. He bought a business on Ridley Road, which is the main road and the centre point of our particular exhibition. This Abraham has become the centre of the community here, providing not only the services you expect from a shop, but he also provides a good sounding board for young people and for people who are looking for help as far as credit is concerned. And there's very few businesses within Ridley Road, which is around really, where providing credit, unsecured credit to people who need it, people who are low income, is being done by him. And what he's found is that, you know, people are very honest with him. He does get his money paid back, but he enjoys being that real main sort of the heart of the business. He's seen so many changes in Ridley Road and weathered different types of competition that's around him. I think he's going to be a person that's going to be in that street for some time, I imagine. He's been there already 20 years. I imagine he'd be there even longer now. Like Dennis, we're going to have an image of Abraham that's going to be one of the key images on the wall that's soon to be launched in September. And again, just like Dennis, there'll be a barcode that will link through to his story, so you can read about Dennis and the role that he plays within the community. Okay, go to the next one.
So yeah, we've already said that we have another exhibition, a very large exhibition coming up in collaboration with Create London as part of the Council's Windrush initiative. But we do have a current one that's on it's an iconic building, Red Cross building in the middle of East London, 92 Dalston Lane. And we've had such a good response to that, both from the press, who've called it the Future Gallery. Again, you know, taking things out of places that are unaffordable and often can make people feel that it's not a space that they're comfortable in, to being on the street where it's free for the public and people can access it in their own time. And again, with COVID, this is working out quite well. So yeah, I think if we,
if we move to the next slide to give you a feel of what this current exhibition looks like. As I said, the large format prints.
Yeah, that's just part of it. So it goes all along that wall, and it's all eye level, which has worked out quite. And I think what has surprised Wayne and I is, kind of touch wood, it has been very well received, and there's almost a sense of people protecting it. They're very large, very expensive images, and they're weatherproof and graffiti proof, and we will leave them up, hopefully. The Red Cross is saying maybe even another 2 years. You know, that it's really given people a sense of pride and well-being, sense of belonging in the area. And again, with COVID and people's sense of place and belonging being thrown all up in the air, the exhibition again seems to have reminded, you know, that local, very local community in Hackney and really around East London, that, you know, that there is a community there that is strong and vibrant.
And since that's been up, and that's been up since November last year, and I've actually hovered around there just to kind of listen in on people's conversations as they walk up and down the wall, and obviously read the text, which is at the beginning of the exhibition. And one of the sort of reoccurring comments I'm hearing is exactly what Donna said. It's they are proud of it. It represents the community. You can see that because even since November, touch wood, they are untouched. One of the comments I did get from somebody who was looking at the images was saying it's so different to see photographic work displayed in this way outside of the sort of traditional gallery space. So this kind of met the brief for us as far as, you know, bringing the art to the community, making it free for those to view. Hopefully it is COVID proof at the time, so it's out in the open and people can walk by without any issues there. And I think that's basically what's kind of led us onto lots of different conversations we're having with people, other collaborations that people are interested in, and of course the exhibition that is due to happen in September. Okay, so I think that's probably it for now. I think we've overshot our time. Apologies for that. It's quite a lot to try and cram into a short period of time, but I'm sure this deck will be made available after this event. But you can see on there's some links that you can click through to, some media coverage that we've had from the BBC, Arts and Culture, from the Guardian, local press, Hackney Citizen, and Time Out magazine as well. And then if you click to the next slide. The next slide, where you can find us, you've got our webpage link and Instagram as well. We do push out quite a lot of content on Instagram if you want to see what's new and any information from us. And there's our contact details there at the bottom.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Wayne and Donna. I'm very excited to see this in September, and thanks for talking about funding. That's something we forget to talk about all the time. We're gonna take a 5-minute break, so we're gonna come back at 12:15, but please get your questions in the Q&A part at the bottom of the screen before we come back, because after we come back, it's question time. So see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, Wayne.
Guys, you need to stay on mute.
Hi, is everyone back? Everyone have time to get a tea and have a pee?
Probably a bit too much detail there, but yeah.
I think if we're ready, we're going to start the discussion portion. As I said, we're having a discussion between the panelists, and then it's time for audience Q&A. But I have a couple of broad questions that I want to ask all of you. If y'all are ready. Good, ready to go? Okay. One thing I wanted to ask was, Peter kind of touched on this when he was talking about the weather and doing things in the nighttime, and sort of having a structure to how he, was creating this work. And I was wondering what considerations you have to make while working in the public space or with members of the public. Like, is there something unexpected that you've run into? Are there any big considerations you need to think of first before you start a project like this? I just want to know what you all think.
Do you want me to start? I think,
yeah, since you referenced it. Yeah.
I mean, the sign paintings for the NHS was slightly unique, that it was something that was made without a great deal of collaboration in the beginning, other than responding to things that were happening. But normally go into any collaboration, it's I don't feel like I know any more, and often feel like I know less than the people that I'm collaborating with. So in that way, it's just starting with a kind of huge deal of respect for whatever and however they're, whatever we're working on. And also in terms of collaborating in the wind, we did a flag project here in Edinburgh for Jupiter. And yeah, we had a force 7 gale, and it was all handheld flags. And so, there's health and safety, all those kind of wider things that you have to think about anyway, whenever you're doing anything. But when you're responsible for others, and especially if it's performative based work, which that was, you do have to then, there are so many other things that you have to think about. But I think the main thing is just, feeling slightly outside of the work that you're trying to, or for me anyway, trying to make, is that, I don't feel like I'm the expert in the room, quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's really important. I think that ties on to what Wayne and Dawn were talking about, if you want to lead that up.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, when it came down to what we did with our work and how we was going to sort of display that, the considerations we had to think about was not only the location, which is great, we had to find a willing donor of the space, because it wasn't fly posting, right? So it needs to be in a secure place. We also needed to think about the materials we were using. So we specifically chose a partner, a printing partner who is known to produce this kind of work in lots of different locations. There's one currently running in Portobello Roads at the moment, on a 100-metre long wall down in Portobello Roads. It's been there for a couple of years now. So we worked with them, and they came up with the products to be able to not only produce the images the way how we wanted it, but also produce it with the materials that will add some longevity. So before we got to that point, Donna managed to have a conversation with the Graham Road, our first exhibition. It's a Red Cross building. It's owned by the Red Cross. They've been in the Hackney, Dalston area for 30 odd years plus, providing services to the community. They bought into the idea. They said, sure, you can use our wall. We've used their wall. I think one of the things we had to consider was chopping down a tree. So we had a tree that was overhanging the wall. So that was, so we had to get our own tree surgeon in to be able to prune that back. Hopefully we weren't too brutal on the pruning back. And the actual images themselves are screwed to the wall. So they've got security screws on there. The materials are quite durable. So if anybody wanted to try and yank it off, it will be a real effort to pull the thing off. And it will weigh a bit as well when it does come off, so they don't end up chopping their toes off or something in the process. And also as well, knowing it's on the roads, and we had to think, well, if you get a lot of people gathering, especially in COVID, is there enough space for people to walk around it without feeling a little bit inhibited by a bunch of people hanging around? So those are the things that we needed to consider. So the location, getting the authority to use, getting the buy-in from the location that you're using the wall from, and then obviously making sure you've got the right materials that you produce and the artwork on.
Yeah, do you want to talk, does anyone want to talk more about like audience considerations? Because Wayne, you touched on making sure no one is like beating up the artwork, right? Any other like audience considerations that you all can think of?
Well, I could talk a little bit like that about that with arrivals and departures. I mean, there's obviously the work is dealing with quite sensitive issues in terms of death and birth, and we do have a lot of people who get quite emotional when they engage with the work, and that was always going to happen. It's kind of quite natural, and it's not necessarily a negative thing in any way. But one of the things that we did, I mean, I've got a list of about 10 things that we needed to consider in terms of the public, to do with lots of technical things like permission, weather, safety, the list goes on. But in terms of actually people-based, there were two things. One is monitoring. So actually, how do we monitor the names that go up on the boards so we're not in any way offensive? So we have a whole system in place where the names go through a system and it gets monitored very quickly. But if there's an issue with it doesn't go, that the system doesn't sort of recognise, then a human being like either myself or Yara, one of our producers, will be alerted, whoever's on rota, and then we'll decide whether that name's appropriate or not. So for instance, we have had problems where people would like put up names of like serial killers just to be funny, like, oh, will they notice that I'm putting up a list of loads of serial killers? And of course we have to like really be careful about what patterns are being presented on the boards. So that's that's about being sensitive to other people. We don't want to offend anybody. But then maybe like more emotionally, what we've had to do is do a whole training program. So whenever we show the work, we have stewards that kind of work with the public. So if you were to see the boards, you'd see there'd be one or two stewards underneath, and they would tell you what the work's about and tell you how you can get involved, etc. So every time we show the work, we do quite a kind of thorough training session with the stewards by myself and Yara, but also with a grief therapist to really prepare the stewards for that conversation in terms of how they can kind of manage that without actually being therapists themselves, because clearly they're not trained, so they can't like start to give like therapy sessions, but they can have a sense of what would be helpful to say and how they can kind of hold that. And also we also have information available for people who do need more support.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't even consider like the serial killer thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a side, but that sort of thing. A lot of people will put up rude words, all sorts of things will come. But yeah, you have to be really careful not to offend anybody, but at the same time allow people to put up names that are important to them. So it's that balance of like how much control as artists do we have over the moderation is always a bit of a tricky one, and it's a fine line.
Great, thank you. Anna, do you want to talk about your reading group and considerations for that?
Yeah, it's not public in the same way that these other projects are, but I mean, the thing that came to mind was that when we started, because we were doing it in person and it was in my house, then actually it was really just people that we just invited people that we'd met, whereas now it's gone online, it's actually able to be a much more open space. And also geographically, of course, it's not tied to people that can make it to, my house. So in that way, if you were trying to work outside of a kind of institutional framework, then maybe that's a kind of useful way of approaching a public space that is kind of easier to manage than a physical one.
Great. Thank you for that. We have one more question that Amalia and I came up with before we move on to the Q&A from the audience. And as you know, we are print students, so we're obsessed with modes of communications. What is the best way to get information out? What is the most like educational, things like that. Davina, you talked about how you wanted your boards to be mechanical because you thought that was the most respectful way to do this, to have something tangible like that. But of course, as print students, we're used to things like billboards and posters and online mediums and things like that. What do you all consider to be the most effective mode of communicating these ideas? Can you think of any?
When you say these ideas, what do you mean by that?
So what do you find has been the most rewarding way in which you have shown your information? Mm-hmm. Is it something physical? Is it something online? Anything?
I think now, you know, lots of these things work together. So you may have an exhibition that is outside and visible to a certain community. And then when it's online, so for example, our exhibitions are in East London. So it's available really mainly to Londoners, or, you know, people who visit here for some reason or another. That's obviously slowing down because of COVID. But that can then tie into an online audience, like our Instagram, for example. You know, we use it as a voice for the community. So recently, a young man was murdered in one of the spaces that we're documenting, Patrick Enzi, and I was over there quite a lot of the time engaging with the community. And they said to me that they would like to get a message to his family saying that they were, you know, very distraught about this murder of a young man, and they didn't know how to do that. And so we put an image on our Instagram from the community to his family, saying that, you know, the community were distraught by this and very upset, and they wanted to send their love to his family, and that message got to his family. And we thought, you know, we're not massive fans of Instagram, but it can be useful in the moment and connecting with a more physical presence.
And adapting, I think that's important too. Anyone else want to talk about modes that they find very powerful?
I mean, for me, I would say, like, for every project Yara and I do is completely different. So we would tap in very much to kind of formats from popular culture. So every project we do will be taking something from everyday life and kind of looking at the natural meaning making found within that, and then somehow subverting it to kind of give it a sort of question somehow. So with the Rise to Watch sport, it's something you'd see in everyday life with, you know, a football, with a series of temporary tattoos, whatever it might be. It's all normal, kind of very familiar. It doesn't look like art. It's only art once you engage with it and you realise there's something about it. So for us, I think there is something about that presence of the artwork, whether that's an object or a print. It's about that physical presence that excites me, and I really sort of see it as a tool for engagement, whatever that might be, but it's about it being recognisable. Does that make sense? So rather than it being a particular thing like printed format or Instagram, it's more, my particular thing is recognisable.
Yeah, something less maybe arty to make it.
Exactly. I'm not interested in making stuff that looks like art. I mean, I love art that looks like art, but it's just not what I'm about. So yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Any other comments before we move on to the Q&A from the attendees?
I think it always just starts with conversation, anything. So there's nothing physical or recorded. It's just about that non-linear conversation that you might have with someone or with a group of people. And then you find a way into whatever the work might be or might become.
Right. Form follows function. Perfect. Easy.
I think, I mean, with our project, because it's become so online, I mean, in fact, we were even broadcasting the in-person one online, even when we were meeting in person. So it's become, you know, the most effective way is to use like social media and things to point to where that's happening. And, you know, it'd be lovely to print things out, but it just doesn't, you know, that's not as quick and it's not as cheap, or it's more effective just to use the channels that everyone's already inhabiting and just point to this this other kind of method of distribution within it.
Thank you for sharing. Amalia, do you want to look at the Q&A from the attendees and say some of those questions?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for those presentations. It's been fantastic, so thank you. I'm firstly going to, this is a question that's open to anyone. And yeah, so what sort of consultation do you have with community co-authors around modes of presentation, or even future exhibition of the work they contributed to? So that, I think that can probably apply to anyone.
I think, oh, sorry, go on.
No. I was just going to check that I got the question right, but I think I did. So keep going, Peter.
No, I was just going to say, for example, the choral work that I made for the Tate, that was made in collaboration with choirs, with singers, with individuals, with people around the Tate, everyone from the outgoing director at the time, Chris Durkin, and then with Francis Morris, but then also I spoke to everyone from the sort of head of the organisation down to the people who were providing meals for the staff, and then everyone around the museum. And it really was in every single conversation that they were aware that they were the work. My interpretation of their conversations and the interpretation that I had that then became the work couldn't exist without them. And it was absolutely vital that they understood that, and that has been acknowledged when that work has been performed. The same with another choral piece made in Iceland. That was exactly the same when we were working with Icelandic fishermen and working with the museum staff, that they were the work, that without them the work wouldn't exist. And in the same way, just because the work is recontextualized, if it's presented in the harbour in Iceland or it's presented here at the Barbican or wherever, it's still the same work, and the same acknowledgements for me always have to be made. And that goes also with the singers who sing the work, that they understand that they're not singers, they're sculpture. They are, for that moment in time, they become the work. And especially if you're working with people who are performing for you, because thankfully I don't perform myself at all, and as a public service I don't do that. And I think that it's really important that they are the work, they own the work, and without them it wouldn't exist. So I think I try to make that as straight and as plain as possible whenever I do that. Sometimes I'm sure I get it wrong, but I hope not often.
Great. Yeah, I think that's something that's also quite relevant for Future Hackney as well, about community being co-authors. I was actually wondering what kind of response do you get from the local community about being involved in this and having like some of their works being like exhibited, like you said, in the exhibition you've got coming up, it's for them like an A-level student, a 16-year-old. Like, how do they feel about having their work presented on such like a big like public stage?
I think. Sorry, go on, Don.
Sorry, you go.
Joined at the hip, clearly. From our perspective, the way when we engage with particular individuals, and not only are we getting their story and understanding who they are, as well as creating the image, which is a kind of almost a byproduct of that, we do ensure that after we've completed that conversation with them, and taken the images, we do come back and give them those images themselves, so they'll have a hard copy of those images. And while we're building that relationship with them, we'll let them know that there is a possibility, not a guarantee, but there's a possibility that they might be on one of the next exhibitions, and get their general feeling on that. Are they happy with that? Are they comfortable with that? Because clearly you need to get buy-in from them, because you don't want a situation where it's a surprise to them. They don't like the idea, and you've already sort of spent a bit of money putting the thing up, and you've got to then swap it out and what have you. So it's taking them on that journey, which is really, really key. But I think giving something back almost immediately kind of helps, because then they can see that it's tangible, it's visceral for them, because they've got a piece of paper that shows that photograph that they took, not just what's on the back of the camera and I disappear. So I think that's quite important. Go on, Dom.
Yeah, and I mean, we really had to win the trust of that community, because in the past there's been some kind of terrible stories in the sort of typical newspapers such as the Daily Mail about that community that have been, totally wrong and misguided. So they didn't initially trust us instantly. I mean, it's definitely, I'd say when it took us about 1.5 years just to win their trust and get them to really understand what we were doing. And so now 3 years later, they do trust us. As Wayne said, we always return. We always return with the images. We discuss, sometimes we teach them things like how to set up Instagram so that they can see the work. So that there's, I would say with my work, about 70% of it is engagement and 30% of it is photography, for sure.
It's about building up a certain level of trust, I guess, as well. People. That's great. I've got a question for Anna that kind of leads on from that. So what do you consider in the remediation from the process of read aloud, the process of the words being read aloud, to the words written, for example, in your print works? What is lost and what is gained when the materials transgress from audio to visual? Do you think it's possible to preserve the sense of the community in that?
So I saw this question earlier when it came in. I'll try and explain what I think it means. So from those reading groups that I do, where everyone's reading, then subsequently I make these big scores, and I think that's what he's referring to, what the print works he's referring to are. So they're kind of laying out all the different versions of the text that people have generated through their voice and kind of lining them up in this way where you can kind of understand what sound has changed into what. And then I paper walls with this text. So it becomes something that you kind of enter with your body as a viewer rather than...
And this is physically exhibited as well, these...
Yes, yeah. Okay. So rather than reading. And so I thought it was interesting that to ask where community is kind of gone in that. So the score, I suppose, in a way is a kind of palimpsest of all these voices, and they're all embedded in the way that the words have changed. But then, you know, the viewer's immersion in that sort of remediated material isn't really about community anymore. You know, it's sort of flipped back to this individual viewer or reader kind of position, I guess. So I feel like the community is very held, but it's not a kind of communal, what would you call, reception anymore, or viewing encounter anymore.
Great.
I hope I interpreted the question right.
Yes, definitely. This is for Davina. Have you considered working for global organisations like WHO or the UN in Geneva? So
I was wondering what that question meant in terms of presenting arrivals and departures for an organisation like that, or in general trying to do a project for a big organisation like that, because they're two different questions in a way.
I think it might have been generally for a big organisation like that, but I guess it would be interesting arrivals and departures in that.
no, because obviously arrivals and departures would be, because we've had obviously we actually, we came up with the idea for arrivals and departures way before COVID, and we have to be very careful because COVID can very easily kind of like wrap it up in a ball and kind of make it about COVID, and actually the artwork is not about COVID. That will come up naturally, of course, but we don't want it to kind of be ever used as a kind of propaganda tool to kind of sort of tell one particular narrative, which I think if we were to work with an organisation like WHO, for example, with arrivals and departures, we'd be very worried about how that artwork would be used to tell a particular narrative, which is only one particular narrative and not necessarily, there's not one truth when we look at that. So, absolutely, we're interested in working with big organisations, but we're very, I'm sure everybody in this room, virtual room, is the same, very kind of careful about who we work with, what the ethics are behind the organisations we work with, who funds them, and we really consider that before we say yes to any institution, because for us it's really important to be authentic to our principles and our beliefs, and also to think about what messages can be put on an artwork really by who you work with. So yes and no is the answer to that.
Okay. I've also got another question for Peter Liversidge. I know some of your, as you mentioned, you've done collaborative works in the past, but I know this, well, from my perspective anyway, the sign painting seems quite different from some of the other work you've done. This process of working in public, perhaps. And I was just wondering, do you think will have any effect, this project, on your practice in general, or it was just like a response to a specific moment in time, just like an impulsive thing, like I just want to do this?
I think it was impulsive, and I think, but equally, it allowed me to make other work. You know, it's one piece of work always leads on to another, or some. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Sometimes it doesn't, but I think it was definitely an impulsive response. I didn't quite know what to do, and at the beginning, within the first 5 weeks of COVID and being locked down, I knew what I was doing till 2023, and I had shows lined up, solo shows, and everything went. And I suddenly had this void of time and not having any understanding necessarily of where or what I was going to do. And then that work, I think I became so obsessed by it because I had more time, and I was spending 5-7 hours a day making signs, making signs and installing them, and then doing that every single day. And it just became a way to get, for me personally, just to get a way to maybe even distract myself a bit. But as far as it allowing that, or inviting me to think in a different way, I think it probably did. I've always thought that I was quite free in making work, but then I realized that in thinking I was free, I'd actually made work in a similar way for quite a long time. Because it's just, sometimes you're asked to do that, or you don't break out of that mold. And I think it probably allowed me to do things in a different way. So yes, it probably will, but probably in the same way as if, you go to the studio and you haven't had breakfast, then you drink lots of coffee, that affects you differently as well. Whereas if you had a good breakfast, the coffee isn't, it doesn't have quite the same effect.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your responses to those questions and taking part in this event. I know everyone's found it really interesting, so thank you very much. And I hope to see more of your work in the future.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, so we're 15 minutes over, but we have to wrap it up. I think we've learned a lot of things that I wasn't expecting. Like we learned from Anna about language, Davina about respecting a narrative in a space, from Peter about adapting, and from Future Hackney about community and paying back your community. And these were all things that I didn't expect. And I found that very interesting. I hope the attendees also found that very interesting. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you all so much for this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thanks for connecting.
I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.